Alright, so this is an old story, kind of a memoir, and I'll just start like that. It was 102 degrees, an hour had passed, and still there was no bus in sight. I squinted at the next set of oncoming cars in the distance, the blaze of the desert sun making the road in between appear to be liquid. I looked at the sign which hovered above the bench on which I sat. It displayed a little picture of a bus. On it were listed the numbers of buses that were supposed to stop here. Yep, it was a bus stop. Was Friday afternoon between 12 and 1 considered off-peak here in the Southwest? As far as I knew, buses were supposed to run every half hour between 7 a.m. and 11 p.m. So where was the fucking bus already? I had moved to Albuquerque just 2 weeks before, and I had just walked out of a pretty awful job interview, way on the other side of town from my house. I didn't have a car yet, so I was pretty dependent on the promise of public transport and rides from my roommate. On this particular day, she had dropped me off at my interview with plans of spending the afternoon exploring the Sandia Mountains. This was 1997, prehistoric in the world of mobile communication, at least as far as we were concerned. Maybe back in New York, people were already standing on 34th Street, squinting and shouting, "Is that you? Are you wearing a red shirt? What? No, I'm in front of Macy's. No, Macy's." But out here in the midst of the tumbleweeds, rattlesnakes, and lowrider cars, we were still confined to phone conversations within 100 yards of our cordless phone's hand cradle. I flicked my cigarette into the road and looked around for a convenience store. I desperately needed a drink. The only buildings nearby were the daycare center I had interviewed at and a cluster of offices. My mouth began to feel as if I had just scooped a handful of the dust at my feet and poured it down my throat. I almost wished I had the means to catch the sweat that rained down from my armpits and balled up in little lakes beneath my breasts and in the bends of my legs. The moment you start to fantasize about drinking your own perspiration, it's time to start weighing your options. My options at that point were pretty limited. I could wait, hoping the bus would finally appear, though I was fairly sure it wouldn't. I could almost imagine the vulture swooping down to gnaw at the flesh of my limp, dehydrated body. I could go to the nearest payphone and call a taxi, but I had less than $100 to my name and still no job. I could walk the 7 or so miles to my house, but since I was wearing the one pair of high heels I owned, becoming lunch meat for the vultures seemed a kinder fate. And that left me one option. I was no stranger to hitching rides. Once in a blue, throughout high school and university, I used my thumb to get around locally. And just 2 summers before, I had thumbed my way across most of the U.S. without a single hitch, pun fully intended. I had been warned that Albuquerque wasn't the safest of cities, but growing up in New York had armed me with a generally fearless attitude and the fierce "don't fuck with me" tucked in my sleeve. I stood up, muttered a little prayer, and pasted on my best hitchhiking smile, innocent yet not naive. A pop of my thumb, flick of my wrist, and bing, bang, boom. A ship-brown Chevy swerved into the right lane and stopped just inches from my probably dumbfounded face. The passenger window rolled down and out shot that famous line, "Where are you headed?" Off of Central, between University and the airport. "Ah, it's right on my way, hop in." I was so thankful for the instant gratification that I barely even glanced at the 40-something male driver as I opened the door and plopped my ass into the passenger seat. Had I studied him more carefully, I might have registered his sleazeball "what would you look like bent over naked" stare, or his lick your lips saccharine smile. But I didn't. At least not until the car was already moving. "So, you're new in town, huh?" His tone was one you'd expect from a patron in a shithole roadside bar, and his appearance confirmed it. He wore look-at-my-bulge, acid-washed jeans and untrimmed sideburns. His face was so pockmarked that I was sure he never got laid as a teenager. I told him about my unsuccessful attempt to catch a bus home, and he let out an abrupt, obnoxious laugh. "There ain't no public transportation in this town." I had tossed up my hair before in a ponytail, and as I stared out the window to confirm that he was headed in the right direction, I felt a warm, clammy hand graze the back of my neck. I jerked away and shot him a glare, which he returned with a grin that exposed coffee-stained teeth and ill-stained intentions. What does it mean? I realized he was referring to the Chinese character I had tattooed on the nape of my neck. Oh, to be. He snorted, like to be or not to be? I couldn't resist a shot at him. I haven't heard that one before. The second I let the sarcasm fly from my lips, I wished that I could reel it back in. A fire flickered in his eyes, and I sunk a little deeper in my seat. We were on a relatively populated street midday, and there were enough traffic lights that I could have jumped out should he have gotten out of hand. Or maybe not, as we were passing through a pretty sketchy part of town. I do not now, nor have I ever feared people whose skin is darker than my own, nor have I ever felt a separation from people who are poorer than me. What I do fear is resentment aimed at me based on assumption and association. A white girl in a suit and heels in a neighborhood laden with gang lairs and crack dens is asking to get blamed for something. No, I certainly wasn't jumping out of the car just now. It would be like running from a bear into a pack of wolves. My best bet was probably just to play dead. From that moment on, I only spoke when spoken to. Unfortunately, the guy had a lot to say. See her? He pointed out the window at a petite Latina woman in a micro miniskirt who strutted down the sidewalk. She's a hooker. Oh. I nodded and raised my eyebrows as if I were fascinated by that little tidbit. She did look like she could be a hooker. Her too. He pointed to another woman, this one not as scantily clad. Maybe. I half nodded. No, she is. How do you know? I asked, trying not to sound confrontational. Because I paid her to fuck me. I just kept nodding as he pointed to a shady-looking motel, right there, in room 306. Cool, was all I could manage to say. I continued to nod and appease my dirtbag benefactor by alternating between uh-huh and really, as he told me all about his patronage of the local prostitutes, many of whom just happened to be walking down the street at that moment. He told me an elaborate story about some crackhead's apartment he had visited where the entire floor was covered in human feces. Then he proudly conveyed the story of the time he beat down a pedophile. That fucking perverted son of a bitch. Scumbags like that really piss me off, you know what I'm saying? He patted my thigh, and I held my breath until his hand was safely back in his own lap. Soon enough, but not really soon enough, we had approached my neck of the woods. I told him where to turn, and when we were just a few blocks from my house, I realized that I did not by any means want this jerk-off to know where I lived. Actually, you could just drop me off right here. Don't be silly, I'll take you to your doorstep. I racked my brain for an excuse, and I nervously pointed to a random house. No, really, my friend lives right there, and I said I'd stop by. You sure? It's really no problem. He eyed me skeptically as I nodded and gathered my purse. Thanks so much, man. You really saved the day. The car had barely stopped when, in one swift motion, I patted his shoulder and swung the door open. I walked toward the designated house slowly, waving. It wasn't until I was on the porch, practically knocking, that he finally drove away, peeling out the way true douchebags always do. I waited several moments, staying focused on the increasingly faint sound of his motor, until I was sure that he wasn't coming back. Then I ran like hell to my house 2 blocks away. I desperately needed a shower, and not just because I stunk. Within a week, I landed a job, one within walking distance from my house. Every time I spotted a brown car, I half ducked. Not long after that, I bought a Subaru for, God's honest, $100, but that's a whole different story. I was independently mobile during the whole 2 years that I lived in Albuquerque, New Mexico. In that time, I saw a whole lot of bus stops. Strangely, I don't recall ever having seen a bus.